Peace everybody, Carol here. Today I'm going to be talking about gravity. Now, all the videos that I seem to love to watch about physics, just everybody says we don't know what gravity is. Okay, so I feel like I know what it is. Knowing what gravity is gives you a lot of peace because it helps you know what unification is, how everything is unified. Because it's not really hard to understand. I thought about it for a long time, trying to think about how to make clean energy that wouldn't form nuclear waste and wouldn't use up our natural resources. And in the process, I had to understand what mass was, and in the process, I had to understand what light was. And then I had to understand what gravity was, because they're all related and they're all the same thing. And gravity is just what we call the phenomenon of moving, accelerating ether. What is ether? Ether is the fluid which we start with. There's this stigma about the word ether, like, oh, that's ancient bullshit, you know, but really and truly, I'm using it in a new way, or maybe it's the same way that other people meant to use, but whatever. I'm just saying that this is the word I have to use, because I'm spelling it A-E-T-H-E-R, because the A-E are the initials for Albert Einstein, because it's taking his general theory of relativity where he left off and just applying it to smaller scales and larger scales so that we can see what goes on around that singularity, which really isn't a singularity of the black hole. It's not a singularity. First, we're just going to say, what is gravity? So, ether is defined as a fluid that existed before anything else existed. And it's like the basis of our existence. And this is the only assumption you have to make. Now, every theory has assumptions that can't be proven. And Gödel even showed that there's no way you can know everything, because then you would have to build a system bigger than what you know, but then that bigger system doesn't include everything because it doesn't include itself. So we already accept that we can't know everything. So let's just say, would you be happy with one assumption? You'll never find a better one. So the assumption is that we start with what we call the void. That's nothing new, right? All the metaphysicists talk about the void that came before everything. So we start with the void, but what I'm going to say is, what is the void? Let's say we know it's nothing, but from a chemical engineer's point of view, I'd like to say that it's a fluid that's made out of no substance yet, except for a continuous structure, but it's got zero viscosity and zero density, and of course density doesn't even exist yet. But if it did, it would have zero density. Okay, so, and viscosity doesn't exist yet either, because in order to have viscosity, honestly, you need to have machines to measure viscosity. And when you only have the void, you don't even have people there to observe it. But again, this is for purposes of conceptualization, no different than saying, like say you want to invent a new math to do things that you couldn't normally do, so you invent a number called the square root of -1. And we accept it. And once you get over the hurdle of the weirdness of it, you start to understand that it's a useful number to use. And all of a sudden, the square root of -1 just seems like a normal thing, you know, and you just call it I, and it's just this unreal number. You call it an unreal number. Well, I'm going to call this an unreal substance, and it's called ether, A-E-T-H-E-R. Ether is the fluid that we declare exists and is the underlying stuff of everything that we are. And that ether has zero viscosity, zero density, and it doesn't have any color, but we're going to say it's black. Because, you know, like kind of like space. But it's not the zero-point field. If you want to create the zero-point field out of ether, which is what we're going to do next, you're going to introduce some kind of a piece of energy or perturbation or somethingness so that our universe can begin. And what we do is we call that God sneezes. Now, you might want to say a cat sneezes, or someone else might want to go, an angel blinked, you know, whatever works for you. But for me, God sneezes is fine, you know, because it's like a single blip of energy, achoo. And to say an angel sneezes, well, gosh, you're creating the universe here, so you should probably use God, you know, because that's like the almighty thing that you can't define. And so when that happens, When any perturbation happens to a fluid with zero viscosity, as any chemical engineer will tell you, you get infinite turbulence. But what is this turbulence? If you stick with the assumption that that stuff of zero viscosity must be a fluid, because of course fluid is, you got to have a fluid to have a viscosity. That fluid of stuffness has zero viscosity, so it's going to start flowing very wildly. And what do fluids that we observe do? They flow in curved lines. And so what you start to have is like the turbulence at the base of a waterfall. You just have this infinite number of curls and swirls and whirls and, you know, vortices and all this crazy flow everywhere. This is now what we call the 0 point field. And it starts to churn, and semi-temporary particles will pop into and out of existence. One might go one way, and to balance it, another goes another way, you know, but then they might dissipate and become other energetic forms. And then the next step is if you go long enough, if you wait long enough and you're an observer in an imaginary, let's just say we're angels and we're observing all this because we're privileged enough to exist before time came into being. Of course, as soon as God sneezes, time came into being, because time is just change. And so as soon as you have these flow patterns, you've got instances that are different than previous instances, and they occur in an ordered fashion, and so that would be time has now begun. So time equals 0 is the Big Bang, and that's when God sneezed. And then all this stuff happens, and then as soon as you look around, you're going to see some semi-stable things that last longer than other things. And of those you might see, at least in our size scale, you'll see photons and electrons and other forms of mass, which is condensed light. Okay, so we start with ether, with viscosity equals 0. Okay, that's what ether is. That's the quiescent void. But if you take that ether and you move, God sneezes, it starts to move and create a lot of little flow patterns within itself. And now the ether is no longer quiescent. So now that it's churning ether, we call it the 0 point field. All the flowing patterns of turbulence, I'll call turbulence some weird t, equals infinity. And then, so that's one, and then this is the second step. And then the third step is light. And you have a vortex of flow. And it's not when you do your mathematical expression of a photon of light, it's not an etheric acceleration vector field of 0 point field. It's an etheric acceleration vector field of the ether itself, which carries the 0 point field entities in it. So if you have a vector field of the acceleration of air around an airplane, and like say the airplane's flying and you have sort of this stable acceleration pattern of how the air curves around the airplane. I'm not talking about velocity here, just the acceleration. Because the velocity of ether is undefinable. It's the acceleration that actually has power and causes things to happen, at least for the purposes of this discussion. You've got the ether has an acceleration pattern that forms the photon. So let's just say that at this point right here, there's an acceleration vector that causes anything at that point to accelerate in that direction towards like the backbone of the photon. That is going to carry with it anything that happens to be there. If there's nothing there, nothing will move at that point or be accelerated. But if there's a bunch of little, if there's just a little like inertia containing swirl of ether in that point, then that little entity, which has an inertia because of its gyroscopic nature of going round and round, rotating stability, it's going to take energy to move that, especially if it's nested infinitely in smaller and smaller whirls and swirls. Because even though the viscosity is 0 and the density of the fluid is 0, if you have an infinite number of nested whirls and swirls, you have a quantity of inertia that's proportional to 0 times infinity. The density or the mass, the density or the mass, whatever, the 0 times the infinite number of nested swirls. And then, so we just call that 1. 0 times infinity, we just call that 1. And so, but if you have a bigger whirl and swirl, then it'll have more than 1. And if you have a smaller whirl and swirl. But anyway, 1 is just like, we're just going to say for now that this one has a value of 1. So it will accelerate, it will be then accelerated into the photon. So the light photon consists of the accelerating ether in the vortex pattern. But you could say that that light photon also contains within it the 0-point field, but that's not what defines the light wave. At least not the mathematics of the light wave. The main key point we need to know now to understand gravity is when you have the 0-point field and then the vortices of light that are formed in the quiescent ether, they suck in space. They suck in space. They inhale space. And then there's an equal and opposite flow of space going outward because everything has to have an equal and opposite. Like if you create something out of nothing, like God sneezes, so yes, you created the initial energy perturbation out of nothing, and that's the assumption we make. But even so, you have to, as that happens, you have every piece of movement that's created by God's sneeze has to have an equal and opposite piece of energy. So kind of like if you have an explosion, it goes equally out in all directions, like that. So this sucks in space and this sucks in space. Now let me say something about sucking in space, because that's what gravity is. It's the movement of space inward to your massive object. Einstein's thought experiment said that if you are flying through space in a rocket and thrown back on the wall, it's exactly the same phenomenon as if you're standing on Earth and space accelerates through you. So let me summarize that. So the truth is, or at least what we assume is true, because we all agree that Einstein's elevator experiment, his rocket experiment, is accepted by everyone, and it makes sense to me because it's a visceral. We all agree that when you stand on a rocket and you're thrown back against the wall, it feels just like standing on Earth. You have the same force, it's the same phenomenon. So accelerating through space is the same as space accelerating through you. Space accelerating through you. That's what I'm saying. It's space accelerating through you. Gravity is just space accelerating through you. And a light wave has gravity because it has space accelerating into it. And that's what makes it flow, because it's a quiescent ether flowing in a vortex shape, and it's sucking in space. And then it flies at the speed of light, c, as we measure it here on Earth and out in space. Actually, that's our local vacuum. It travels at the speed of c in our local vacuum of our universe. Now, you could further say, well, in order to understand gravity, you really should understand what mass is. So I'll just say that, light, when you put it into an appropriate etheric acceleration vector field, which you might call it the warped space-time of the Big Bang, where everything's really moving and churning a lot, and ether is really moving around a lot, it can bend this light wave. And if the head meets the tail, guess what? They're both sucking in space. And so what will happen is it'll just click into place into a stable, circular moving light wave. And the mathematics of this light wave is just superimposed upon itself in a circle. And then you have the mathematics of this toroid-shaped flow of the quiescent void in the form of a vortex twisted in a circle, sort of like a snake swallowing its tail, and that would be an electron. Now, there's other forms of mass, and that's a whole nother discussion, but this is like the most elementary, easy to understand form of mass. And there's charge associated with it. Might as well just, as an aside, point that out. There's charge associated with an electron because the ether flows toward it, but not like a singularity. when ether accelerates into the electron, just like it flows into the photon, but instead of going into it in a straight line, it kind of coils into it like this. So one little speck of 0-point field swirl or whirl, which I call a glittering fairy dust, that little particle will flow into the electron like that, and it'll start to, form this spiral pattern of the photon. But since it's going in a circle, it'll do the spiral pattern around and 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 around like that. And all directions it comes in and does that. Whoops, got to do it the right way. It has to be this way because of the handedness of the light. And so then from over here it would come in and it would go like that. And over here it would come in and go like that. But it's not just like that, it's also spiraling and then going along. So there's multiple levels of curvature in an electron. That's the first one. There's actually an infinitely nested number of levels of curvature flow in the 0-point field, but since we can't measure it, we're just going to say that the number of nested gyroscopic levels in the 0-point field is 1. So we call that G1. And this one is G2, because that's the number of nested gyroscopic levels in the photon. The number of nested gyroscopic levels in the photon is 2. And that means that it's the 0-point field with one more level of gyroscopic flow curvature of whatever the ether carries with it when it goes into the photon's shape. And then the electron has the photon's doubly nested gyroscopic property with an additional level of curvature, so the electron is G3. And so now we're going to look at just a single electron, and you'll see what gravity is now. So here's our electron, and a fairy dust particle out here would flow into it, and it would be carried in. That's the back side of it. Carried in, and then it would come around, and then the back side of it, and you see how it's going in a spiral pathway, and then the back side of it coming over here, and then the back side of it. But then as it flows along, it's starting now to flow in a smaller spiral, and then it goes around and around, and it's still spiraling small, but very, very small, and then it just goes around forever and ever and ever, and the whole system, the electron that looks like a toroid is pulling in ether from all directions. And so you've got ether going into the electron all the way around it. But if you draw a dotted line around this electron, and now I'm going to miniaturize this so I can draw on the blackboard sort of an equation thing. So here's your electron, and you've got ether going in. Okay, well, this is accelerating ether. So there's, at every point out here, there's an etheric acceleration vector. And I'm doing 2D, but if it's in 3D, okay? And this is like a bagel, like this. See, and there's the direction of flow, showing the spirally moving fairy dust particle trajectories on this. It's just a kid's rattle, but I used it for my Blaney bagel model of an electron. So if we remember the Einstein's thought experiment, that accelerating through space is the same as space accelerating through you, well, this is space accelerating into the electron, just like space accelerates into the Earth, where people are standing. There's people on the Earth, and that's the land. Those are the poles. For now, those are the poles. And here's all the people, and space accelerates into the Earth. And the reason I'm not drawing the arrows going into the Earth like the electron is because the Earth isn't a giant electron, nor is it a black hole. It's got a bunch of these in there, but they sort of average out. And so what you see if you stand on the surface of Earth is just ether coming in at what seems like a straight line. But if you zoom in on all the little electrons, you'll get the curved flow into the electron. But the summation of all the electrons and protons and neutrons and everything in the earth, it's massive, and including the light as well, it all sucks in ether and it's all additive. And so you'll have a summation of all the acceleration vectors of x, y, z, and t all over the earth, ds, and that would be like the surface of a dotted line around it, which defines the force of gravity is defined by this. All the etheric acceleration vector fields around the earth. And this is just, this, is Newton. This is what Newton said. Newton's law of gravity, where, there's a force of attraction between two objects that's proportional to the two masses of the objects divided by the distance between them, squared. So that's what gravity is, ether accelerating into the earth. What's ether? I told you what ether was. The fluid of zero viscosity that carries the 0-point field with it. And when it flows into a vortex, and when the vortex flows into a toroidal-shaped electron, you get entities that suck in ether in an accelerated fashion, and this causes a force. And this is what makes up all subatomic particles, all particles, all atoms, all molecules, everything, and light as well. And if you were going to make an exact calculation of the gravitational force of the Earth, you wouldn't only include the mass, you would also include the light. There's a lot of light waves on the Earth that are like in my body. There's tons of light waves being exchanged, all that energy. That's energy because it's all sucking in ether, and it all has inertia, and it takes energy to move it. And even though the photon is moving at the speed of light, or faster if it's outside of galaxies, in the empty free space where there's nothing much going on, it may be traveling faster than the speed of light, but it's still limited by the density of the local 0-point field. The nature of this particular viewpoint of our existence, and that's all this is, it's a viewpoint that explains what gravity is. And if you were to pursue this theory with me, and I hope you do, I invite you to watch my videos, I'm going to be presenting it, you would understand that this explains everything, all the experiments that are coming out. It explains dark energy and dark matter, which are forms of the etheric acceleration flux, in the soup of ether. And it explains the expanding universe, and it explains, I believe that it can explain the particle wave duality. So that'll be my new life's work, is to share this knowledge. It's a viewpoint based on that one assumption that, of course, we can never prove, that the fluid of the universe is a viscosity equals zero fluid. But with that assumption, you can really understand everything. And so that makes me think that it's a very useful assumption, and it's a very useful viewpoint, and I'm excited to share it with you. So thank you for letting me tell you what I believe gravity is, and I look forward to sharing many more videos on the theory that utilize this viewpoint. I believe that Einstein knew all this, and the only difference between this and his work, besides the fact that he's an awesome genius and I'm not, is that he didn't really take it down to the small level of what happens in an electron. Why is light convertible to mass? Well, this explains everything. It shows you the form of flow, the flow of the quiescent ether that forms the 0-point field, the flow of the quiescent ether that forms photons, which contain the 0-point field, because that's part of the soup, and then electrons, which contain the photon, and so forth, to build our universe from scratch. And it explains the strong and weak nuclear forces, gravity, and charge. And expanding universe, dark matter, dark energy, it also explains, and this is one of my main motivations, Reiki healing. A lot of phenomena in biophysics can be explained by this. This gives you a way to visualize what's going on. So it's very useful. And when you are laying on your deathbed, this is very useful to know, because you know that you are accelerating ether. And that energy that you are is continuous with everyone else. And you are just an illusion. You are really accelerating ether. And that is the same as consciousness. Consciousness and accelerating ether arise together. And our concept of me-ness just comes from life wanting itself to be, and the systems that last long are the ones that last long, and then the systems that dissipate out don't hang out very long, do they? Because they dissipate out. So that's why the long-lasting systems, the low entropy systems, are what give rise to us, who can think about these things, talk about these things, contemplate them. And the evolution of the universe is going to consist of fewer and fewer of these long-lasting, low-entropy systems, such as human beings that have brains that can think. Less and less of those, but in the process, they'll be getting more and more intelligent and more connected, more and more complex, you could say, but also more and more beautiful. So, one example would be, when the multiple cells that used to swarm around in the ocean formed into multicellular organisms, you'll notice that the number of multicellular organisms that got formed, the number of those is a lot fewer than the individual cells that made them up. So there's fewer and fewer of the multicellular organisms as compared to the single-celled, but those bigger organisms are more ordered. They have to be in order to survive. The ones that aren't ordered don't survive. So they're ordered, and they communicate with their environment in a more useful, productive way, efficient and useful way, and form the beautiful thing which is you and I, that interacts with each other and learns that we're connected. In fact, every light photon is connected to every other light photon, is connected to every other mass particle, and everything is connected to everything else. Just like Lynn McTaggart said in her book, The Field. That's why it's very important to wish people well and to see their God self, because we're all connected. And if you think you're not connected to others, it's just a delusion. Nothing wrong with having delusions, but the less delusions you have, the longer you'll live and the more you'll contribute to a lower entropy state of happiness. So, that being said, live long and prosper. Take care, everybody.